Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to see a full room. We were really afraid that all of you will be with luggages and already in a mood for party for home. I made my big move to Melbourne, but in the keynote, I'm going to bring you from Europe to Melbourne and back. And I'm very happy I have the opportunity to talk about experimentation. And we have all been very romantic, nostalgic about the 10 years of sustainability transitions research. And I do remember our first collaboration with James that we had to really search very, very hard to find one transformative experiment to include in our paper. And years after that, we are talking about the proliferation of research on experiments in transitions. That makes me also able to give the keynote and focus from that point on. It's very easy to say that experiments do bring change. They do bring lessons learned, and they also create evidence for more transformative action. In our book on urban future, being commissioned and being supported by Future Earth, one of our synthesis propositions from all the work that we engaged with in the Future Earth global outreach is that in order to secure a better urban future, we need to engage to produce and integrate actionable knowledge. A means to do this is experimentation. I have to say I'm not only a transition scholar, I'm also publishing heavily on environmental governance. I work very closely with the people from Stockholm Resilience Center, the Resilience Crew, and also very much with urban ecology scholars. I'm very happy to see some of these friends also here because most of the times transitions community has been neglecting all things nature. There's a lot of heavy load on technology, a lot of talk about innovation, but where is the nature in all this? So over the last years, worked a lot with bridging and actually engaging with other communities, with other researchers, that they work a lot on urban ecology, ecosystem services, nature-based solutions. And a lot of times I was the only transition scholar talking about experimentation, sustainability transitions, transition governance. It was very exciting, produced very nice papers and also very powerful, I have to say, and impactful policy narratives and policy impact. To go to the big picture, the first proposition is we have collected enough evidence nowadays to say that experimentation accelerates sustainability transitions in cities. It is a means and a governance instrument that is forwarding social and policy learning. Very frequently is being advocated as a knowledge mechanism for creating capacities, new capacities for governance of cities. At the same time is beyond trialing of solutions and trialing of technology. It's also about governance. It is about new institutions, new relations, new configurations of the social fabric. It's also about connecting different types of innovations, and this is also what we saw in the most recent European projects. It was about bringing the social innovators together with the very willing and receptive policy champions, and see what they can bring together, what they can figure out of progressing urban agendas. It's also about challenging. It's also about pushing and even breaking the status quo, and especially when it comes with social norms, with stereotypes about different roles. And is a governance means overall? I'm going to just indicate and present you some of the examples, because it also comes with some type of frustration. A lot of research on experiments has focused very much on what at least I call the post projects. Like, look at Stockholm, the Hammarby area. It's very sustainable, it's very beautiful, it's like the perfect people. And it's like a sustainability icon. Amazing, yeah, good. Write 20 papers on this. Then I'm coming from Drift, right? And like Rotterdam, they do a lot of good things. And then we are like, of course, overstudy them and showcase them. And we help the city to create a city marketing narrative. But what about areas that they are not so privileged? What about our deep unsustainability areas, and how can we infuse transition thinking? How can we put our knowledge into place to actually make transformative action? In the Resilient Europe project, I work with 11 cities in the most impoverished areas of the cities, in deep deprived neighborhoods. I was also amazed to find out that there are areas in Europe that they don't have water infrastructure. They're not having urban drainage. They're not having wastewater systems in place. And these are in the capital of the city. There's a neighborhood that has been completely forgotten. We talk about neighborhoods that they have energy poverty. They were just like burning waste to heat up. And you're like, seriously? I mean, your city is like the icon of green capital, blah, blah. And then this neighborhood is like right next to the center. These were the areas and the cities have engaged in setting up and rethinking what urban resilience means. What transitions do we need to start from local to city level so as to make it more sustainable and more resilient? Lots of experiments that were put in place, lots of lessons learned, and lots of also closing the loop from designing to implementing to monitoring and also to bring it up to the urban agenda. One of my favorite examples is coming from where I'm coming from, and that's Greece. And this is the city of Thessaloniki. Guess what's the biggest challenge in practically all the city, but also especially in the deprived neighborhoods, is accessibility, is sustainable mobility. And in the experiment we had there, we have to engage and we had to include the people who hate the bikes, as you cannot read Greek, but you can, I think the picture speaks on itself, versus the people who were really fanatic on, we need the bikes, kick out the cars, take up the streets, make the city, to the naked cyclists, that they're like, oh, we can promote our city as a sexy city. And you like have to include also a very radical mayor, Boutaris mayor, that resigned because of age, to make sense of what will make the city to become a sustainable city in terms of accessibility to these neighborhoods, in terms of updating our mobility infrastructure. How can we use the bicycle and cycling as a catalyst to a more sustainable future? And it was very exciting to see how to navigate all the chasms. So yes, it was about creating new forms of social institutions by bringing the people who were actually wanting to kill each other. And then I moved, and also published about it. And then I moved to Melbourne. I was like, oh yeah, well, they were asking me, okay, transitions, yeah, that's very sexy. So what are you doing mainly? Like, what were you doing before coming here? So I'm like, I'm working a lot on experiments. I'm not the only one, of course, the transitions community. They're like, yeah, we're also having scale up of experiments. So I'm like, okay, great, let's talk. So they showed me this, like, do you know the Internet of Things? I'm like, yeah, I know the Internet of Things. So they have like trialed that in a number of houses. They have, like, of course, like a lot of protocols and ethics standards of how to do the experiment, a lot of like user interface, co-design protocols, everything like design space, people-centered. And they were like so excited because now we are scaling up. Because Swinburne has an amazing agreement with Siemens. And Siemens, together with IBM and Swinburne, they want to scale this up to Melbourne. And I was like, okay, that's amazing. That's like a fantastic concept. You're scaling up an experiment that you see that is like well received. Are there risks on that? You know, what about the social learning? What about the digital disruption, digital exclusion? You know, like how do you play out on this? And they were like completely agnostic to all the additional outputs, neglected social effects that experimentation can have. We do have a role to play there as transition researchers, go beyond the positive language. And going beyond the positive language and not being blindfolded by our advocacy, actually, that experimentation as a means to accelerate transitions, is to also pay attention that is actually a multi-actor playfield. And research has been done in this field of looking also, you might say, on the micro level of institutions, on looking how, through experimentation, as an output of experimentation, is a shifting of roles. And by shifting the roles, we are also shifting and tilting the institutions for which experimentation is taking place. Obviously, here I didn't put businesses and SMEs because Sarah is coming after me to just say everything about it. But this is also something that by revealing it, we also expose of like the magnitude of impact. And the impact we need to be aware of what we need to be critically examining as the role of experimentation in transitions. In all these projects and in all the debates over the last years about experimentation, there is always a very big question. And the very big question is about the impact. We all talk about the premises and why to experiment and the objectives and the wishful thinking, but do we actually make the change that matters for progress in transitions? I had, of course, the opportunity among working with many people in this room and many people we're missing in this room to work with Lea Funschilling and Lars Kunen, who is suffering in Melbourne right now, on a project to ask exactly this question. What is the institutional impact that experimentation can bring? We don't have the golden answer. We really tried very, very hard, and we are still collecting, I have to say, ideas and evidence. But we saw some projects over the years, also after publishing the special issue, that can elucidate a little bit where to look at and how to evaluate impact of experimentation. In the Connecting Nature project, Drift is highly involved in it. There was like a mapping of nature-based solutions experiments in Europe. We mapped the successful ones, the ones that scaled, but we also mapped the ones that failed. Trust me, mapping failed experiments was far more difficult than the successful ones because we have the bias of what works. We think that, yeah, it's kind of a little bit of a blind spot, but I'm sure people are picking it up. In all these scaled cases, we saw a very serious and common driver. This is state funding. It's of course the willingness, it's of course the knowledge, it's of course the readiness of actors to engage and make it into the ground. But when municipal, like state and local level, city funding was absent, they were just failing. They couldn't continue. Moving to Australia, looking on the big catalogue of experiments being done and being proliferating by the CRC of low carbon living, a common factor there as well. Wherever there is state support and industrial funding, a lot of experiments there just scale. But the critical appraisal, the critical evaluation of those experiments is still something to be done. The CRC is sunsetting in 3 days, and the evaluation is left as like, it's going to be very good if we evaluate impact. Some projects, though, they went beyond that, and we do have the full cycle of monitoring to also point what was the impact of this experiment. And I have the luck that actually the two very successful and showcase like poster children of the experiments, they are like performed by top researchers of the center I'm now in. And it's about greening the grey fields. It is about how do you change land use in a city like Melbourne that there are zoning strategies, but the city is at the same time sprawling and densifying. And there are very strong imperatives because it is a booming market, it is an expensive market, there's a lot of like capitalism behind, but at the same time it's also a city that faces a lot of climate change pressures. So how do you create the more livable city while densifying and also dealing with like all these transitions in housing? The how, they promoted experimentation as a way of de-risking the state and the municipal support. They looked on how they framed and co-framed statutory planning, policy planning, and used experimentation to actually operationalize it. Then it's also about the scale of experimentation that is amazing. I mean, these 2 pilot precincts, one is the size of Rotterdam as a city. Because I was like, oh, so nice, so it's 2 precincts. And then the people who were like doing all the modeling, like, I was like, okay, give me a little bit of relative scale. Like, how much is, the area we are talking about in your precinct? And he was like, Rotterdam. So I'm like, you're calling it Rotterdam. He's like, no, it's the size of Rotterdam. I'm like, okay, yeah, we're in Melbourne. Yeah, scale is different. And the other one, they're like, yeah, it's like Amsterdam and a little bit bigger. So I'm like, oh, okay, that's good. He's like, yeah, but they're a small scale, eh? So I'm like, yeah, probably for Melbourne, that's small scale. So, of course, they work with these districts. They did all the engagement. They worked very hard over the last 3 years. But because of the nature of the funding and because of the nature of the timelines, they actually managed to bring it all the way to policy change. They didn't only impacted statutory planning, but they also impacted the way the practitioners, the builders, they work, the way the designers, they have now guidelines of how to green the grey fields. And this is a success story because it went from concept to idea to the market to bring policy change. At the same time, it goes also beyond the cities. It starts the cities, but it goes all the way up to the welfare state. In another project, looking on housing transitions and inequalities that might create, it also brings that when you do experiments in a strategic way across all these different themes, touching the income element, the basic income question, the welfare state dismantling, and how this might play out with the whole just city transitions, you might also tackle more precarious questions that a lot of experiments and even a lot of planning and strategies might actually avoid. So it does make sense on how you design the experiments and also how you design research on experimentation on like crossing the scales. And this is I'm almost finishing. It's a lot that we do on transdisciplinary research for experimentation. It's a lot of evidence we are gathering. Our role as researchers is very important. But frequently, and we had this discussion the last 3 days in different sessions I was involved, what does this mean when we go back to our research homes, to our universities? Are you supported? How do you communicate it back to your faculty, the discipline you're coming in? That was a continuous struggle. And when I was at Drift, but of course Drift is not alone. Like a lot of centers and a lot of groups that they work on transitions, they have the similar like institutional disconnect. So when I arrived in Swinburne, I had this amazing meeting with all the people above my head, and they started describing like, oh yes, you're in a center of excellence, and urban transitions is a discipline of the future. It's like, discipline? I don't think transitions is a discipline. I think actually it's an interdiscipline or cross-discipline. They're like, oh, let me explain. And then we have the institutes, and the institutes are the new interdisciplines. They cross across all the faculties, like the Institute of Social Innovation, the Institute of Smart Cities. So I look on the Vice Provost Research. I'm like, okay, explain to me how, that's a very nice vision. He's like, no, this is how the university is structured. I'm like, okay, so the multidisciplines are your interdisciplines, and the interdisciplines are your disciplines. What about the disciplines? He's like, they're dying. I'm like, oh, okay, that's innovative. He's like, can you imagine a university without disciplines? I'm like, have you said that to the faculties? He's like, they will figure it out. So he calls it the university ecosystem. And John Robinson said, when we talk about embedding the transition, it's also about the social practice, it's about the job description, it's about what you do in everyday life that shows that, the whole transition has been moved beyond the talk shop. So it is an ongoing experiment what's happening in Swinburne. And I tell you that now I'm going home back tomorrow. And my first meeting is with a new dean of the School of Social Sciences that is on transformative media, that she's going to sit on the center of transformative media. And everybody's extremely confused with the project description that she has. The only one who's not confused is the Vice Provost Research, because he smiles very happily when everybody says, but she's not a sociologist. What is she doing in social sciences? She's on media. Why do we need media? She's like, she's a very nice person. She has a broad understanding of the role of the university in society. just going to be an interesting experiment. I hope to tell more next year. Let's see how we survive that. And then turning to our critical hats. Of course, there is a lot of impact generated by experiments, but there is also a lot of instrumentalization of experimentation, about creating, if not blocking, but delaying the transition. There is a lot of experimentation for the sake of experimentation, and I hope I'm not the only one who's seeing that and saying that and writing about this. There's a lot of trialing. Yeah, we're not yet sure, we're not yet ready to institutionalize it. Let's experiment a little more. There is a lot of also buying in and buying time strategy, let's delay a little, we haven't figured it out, we don't have the money, political conditions are not ripe, so let's experiment about it. Resilient Europe project, I saw this in a number of cities. They were actually masterminds of how to use research projects again and again and again for stalling any actual change. It was like changing without change situation. Then we have a lot of city marketing through experimentation instead of city making. And we have seen quite of a strong and imperative narrative on 100 resilient cities. I work with 20 resilient cities from the Rockefeller network the last years. And the question I was always asking, it was okay, it's amazing, you learn a lot, you have all this peer-to-peer learning, you learn about new instruments, you create new institutions with chief resilient officers. But do you really progress your urban agenda and implementation to make your cities more resilient? Or it is all about, top-down knowledge saturation? Yeah, I believe for some of the cities is again a delaying strategy. And then a number of cities and in a number of contexts, experimentation has been used largely to avoid the big question. We experiment on the margins, not to address the core issues. And of course, we as researchers, and a number of researchers, they embark into the experimentation research agenda without also reflecting on own role. I've seen a lot of knowledge extraction rather than knowledge co-creation. And that is also something that, in my view, plays a role on how we all contribute into actually delaying transformative action. Having said that, I have two points about what, in my view, from my experience, and the different projects and different contexts I've been involved in, we need to take on board for moving forward as transitions community. I think we need to stand more critical of what experimentation is and what is actually transformative in experimentation. Is it the approach we are using, the transformative one? Is it the impact? We might do something very, very simple in an experimentation context, but then the impact is rather transformative. Is it also because we are talking a lot about experimentation in this community? We're not the only community we talk about experimentation, but sometimes I feel, is this really the only means for governing the transition? Why we don't have a panoply of tools? If you go to other communities, they have a lot of different elements and a lot of different approaches of how to actually govern contemporary phenomena or contemporary problems. Maybe that's also a question to open up. And then for those of us that we are committed to continue doing research on experimentation, is also a reflection to our own practice. In my view, we need to be very strict with ourselves and systematize and also innovate our transdisciplinary research for experimentation. And this is very, very important. It is already hard to survive academia as it is, and things are moving, but also not having a systematic research approach about experimentation, it also makes it even harder to move it forward, to harvest, to learn, and to see what needs to be done better. Then experimentation maybe can be seen as transitions research overall, and then we can also benefit from a dialogue with other type of disciplines and other communities that are booming around us. We look also a lot that we are talking about experimentation for setting up new things, for breaking through the regime. What about the destabilization, ex-novation, dismantling of institutions? This is also a question we raised in the special issue with Lea and Lars. And what about the politics in experimentation, not of experimentation? That's also a question nobody has asked so far. And then there are very starting attempts. I cannot locate Bruno, Paula, Kivima if they are in the room, but hi. They already asked this question: what happens beyond experimentation? How do we understand the mechanism, the institutions, the feedback loops, and how they can also inform designing better experiments for having transformative impact? That is also something that I think will benefit also the research on experimentation. Thank you.